noir, suspense, true crime, hard-boiled fiction. Explore the dark alleys and cheap gin joints of mob history, noir films, hard-boiled paperbacks, and two-fisted pulp fiction with mystery writer and make-believe detective Stephen Gomez. Grab your fedora and button your lip as you enter the office of the internet's finest fictional detective agency, the Noir Factory.
Dmitri Matheny is a Nashville native who grew up around music. He studied at the Berklee College of Music, where he graduated magna cum laude. From there, he continued his studies in New York, where he became the protege of the legendary Art Farmer. Dmitri has become a force in the jazz community, where he's been praised by critics and audiences worldwide. He's performed in over 19 countries and worked with some of the biggest names in the business. He has produced, composed, arranged, or performed on over 120 albums, working with some of the best talent in the jazz world. He's an award-winning musician and a proponent and educator for the art form. His work can be seen on the big screen as well as the small, such as in PBS documentary Mary, Paradox, and Grace. And I'm starting to run out of breath here. Dmitri's work runs a gambit of jazz styles, but you can find an element of noir all through his art. In fact, Dmitri's latest album, Jazz Noir, takes on the classic sound of crime jazz, film noir, and classic motion picture. Dmitri, welcome, and thank you so much for talking with us.
Oh, hey, Stephen, I'm delighted.
Okay, now I gave you the best intro I could work up, but give us the exhaustive version, if you will, and tell us what you'd like us to know about your past. Now, I know musicians, they're notorious for not talking about themselves, but help us break that stereotype of kid from Nashville falls in love with the flugelhorn.
Well, I moved around a lot as a kid. I lived in Nashville until I was 5, then lived in Georgia till I was 12, then lived in Arizona for a while, went to high school in Michigan, then, as you mentioned, college in Boston, then lived in San Francisco for 20 years.
Wow.
Now I'm up in Washington State.
Oh, we're in Washington State.
Yeah, in a little town called Centralia. It's halfway between Portland and Seattle.
Nice. I'm actually up in Ferndale, close to the Canadian border.
I know where you are. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, that's God's country up there. I really do love it. I love all of the rain and mist and fog and greenery and the water. It's just right for me.
Same here. It really helps the creative process.
Yep.
Okay. You mentioned when you were a kid that your father, your parents were big into music. What kind of music did you grow up with?
Well, now this is interesting. My dad, he only had a few LP records. You know, if younger listeners to your podcast might know what that is. You know, vinyl, and he had like he had Ray Charles and Crystal Gale and Glenn Campbell and he had Rachmaninoff but he had this record of Miles Davis called Kind of Blue. And he played it over and over, and I just really fell in love with it. And I remember asking him as a kid, you know, Daddy, what's that sound? He said, well, that's Miles Davis playing jazz. And I said, I want to do that. And when they would ask me as a kid what I wanted to do when I grow up, I would say, well, I want to be a fire truck. They would say, you can't be a fire truck. And I'd say, okay, I want to be the Green Lantern. They say, well, you can't be the Green Lantern. I say, okay, then I want to be a Miles Davis. And so I'm trying to be a Miles Davis as best I can.
Well, you're doing a good job, but you're even better, Dmitri Matheny. Now, that is a pretty eclectic collection your father had.
Yeah, he didn't have many recordings, but they were all over the map, and he just liked good music. And then he raised me. I was raised by my father. My parents separated when I was an infant.
Oh.
And just I'm now 50. I'm going to turn 52 on Christmas Day. But right around the time of my 50th birthday, I met my mother and found out that she was a jazz singer, or what they called a torch singer.
You're kidding.
She used to sing in little clubs, and so apparently I come from a musical family. I didn't even know it.
It's just in your blood,
I guess.
Now, do you still find that you're listening to the full swath? Are you still listening to the old Glenn Campbell stuff as well?
Definitely. In fact, I find that there's a profound absence of melody in a lot of contemporary music. It's kind of frustrating for me. I spend a lot of time on the road, and I get the XM radio so that I can listen while I'm driving.
Mm-hmm.
And I listen to all these genres, and there'll be high production values and a nice beat, and, somebody rhyming, but I'm talking about country music or hip hop or R&B or whatever, and I just keep searching the dial until I find a melody. And it almost doesn't matter to me what style of music it is if it's a strong melody. So right now in my concerts, we're a jazz band, we improvise, but we play melodies from a lot of, we play Stevie Wonder, we play Soundgarden, we play Glenn Campbell, we do a Jimmy Webb's tune, Wichita Lineman, which is just an awesome, in fact, a very noir melody. The composer said it was a song about an ordinary man thinking extraordinary thoughts, which I just love.
That is great. I'd heard that song, and I hadn't made that connection before.
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting. You think Stevie Wonder too? I put Golden Lady on this jazz noir album alongside Bernard Herrmann and David Raxon and Henry Mancini and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And a couple of people said to me, well, I don't really understand why that's noir. And I sort of go with the Eddie Muller definition of noir, which is more open to what has been influenced by that sensibility. And you listen to Stevie Wonder, and he'll write a song, and it'll be a love song, but it'll have this kind of hopefulness and melancholy at the same time. It's a really difficult emotion to capture, and it's all up in noir movies and Pulp Fiction. The feeling of doom, and yet you're going to go after it anyway. Yeah.
Yep, your destiny is broken, but you're still there.
You got it.
Okay, now, like I said, I've loved listening to your back catalog. Your sounds are, it's pretty much everything I fell in love with jazz with the first place. In fact, when I describe jazz, that's pretty much what I'm trying to describe to people. And I do really just a horrible job of it. How do you describe jazz to people who just don't know it or haven't experienced it? Or even worse, people who tell you, I don't like jazz because that's what happened when elevator doors close.
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, as I acknowledge that they have a point. I mean, I think that a lot of people who don't like jazz, what they don't like is a lot of noodly, a lot of notey music that seems kind of self-indulgent. Or maybe they don't like this sort of glossy, smooth jazz that you hear in elevators. I know that when the melody ends and we start improvising, if the music is too frenetic, there's too much going on for someone to if it makes it difficult for someone to latch on to. Which is to say that instrumental music right away, if you don't have words, if you don't have lyrics, for some people, you lose some people right away with instrumental music. And then if you have a lot of, if you have a lot of stuff going on that isn't lyrical or melodic, it's very challenging for non-musicians in particular to appreciate, to enjoy. And so I'll say, I totally know what you mean. And there's a lot of bad jazz out there. I mean, there's a lot of jazz that I don't particularly like. The stuff that I like is more cinematographic. It creates a mood image in the mind of the listener. And it kind of establishes a vibe and makes you feel cool. And I'll give examples of the way that music is used in movies and television to kind of create an atmosphere or a mood. And that's really what we're trying to do when we perform. And for me, jazz is not so much a genre as it is a process. You can give a jazz treatment to pretty much any melody. If the song has strong bones, you can take a heavy metal song or a piece of classical music, give it a jazz treatment. It just has to do with the process and what you're bringing to it. A little bit of blues inflection, a little bit of improvisation, maybe a little bit of swing rhythm. These uniquely American elements can jazzify whatever you want. But I always try to stay away from those aspects of the music that are off-putting to the non-musician. I think that we don't do ourselves any favors by playing only for ourselves as musicians, if you know what I mean.
I think I do. Okay, now there's something I'm dying to ask you, and that's on your website. You mentioned something called crime jazz. What is crime jazz?
Oh, crime jazz is, I'll describe it to you thusly. It's the Femme Fatal, the cop on the beat, the hard-boiled detective, the saxophone under the street lamp in the fog. It's the music of Chinatown and Taxi Driver. It's also the incidental music that you might find behind a 1970s television detective crime drama. Columbo is on the case, or Macmillan and Wife. And, there's the music for the car chase, and there's the music for the love scene. There's always the music for the murder, and you know when it's coming. We were watching Ironsides the other day. I was sitting with my father. And, no, not Ironside, Perry Mason. We're watching Perry Mason.
Oh, man, music drives Perry Mason.
Oh, it's great. And there's a moment when what's the guy named Paul Drake, his buddy that's a detective that does this kind of backdoor work.
Oh, yes.
And he's like he's in some garage, and it's dark, and nothing has happened yet. There's no crime has been committed yet. And my dad said, "Well, isn't there usually a murder?" And I said, "Yeah, there usually is, and usually you know when it's coming because the music will telegraph it." And sure enough, he starts walking into this dark garage, and you hear this, this very low bass note, and then this kind of, frenetic kind of high pitched psycho-esque strings. Oh, it's coming, man.
Oh yeah, they telegraph that punch well.
Right. So that stuff is crime jazz. And also the sort of the spy thriller genre, the music that you have behind James Bond. I would include that in the spy jazz category, in the crime jazz category as well.
Oh, yeah. You can play that little James Bond blurb in 3 a.m,
right.
No picture, and you'd know exactly what they were talking about. Right.
Absolutely. And a couple of those devices, there's something called the minor line cliche that we all use in jazz, and, if a musician is listening, it's like, A minor, major 7, A minor 7, A minor 6, and when you hear that, that's right out of James Bond. And when you hear that, you're like, oh, something's going down in the alley, something sinister is about to happen. And, I very much like that mood and that genre. Yeah, crime jazz.
Okay, now, you spoke about movies like Chinatown, Taxi Driver, even Double Indemnity, Touch of Evil. What
Right.
the music there is every bit as important as the dialogue as a set. What about these movies speaks to you so much, and why do you love them so much?
Well, the movies are great. And when people talk about them, they often talk about the visual elements because human beings are visual creatures. For example, you mentioned Touch of Evil, and everyone always talks about that opening shot, the very beginning of that movie. Orson Welles has this long camera pan that goes on. You're going down the street, and you go up over the building, and you go down, and you see the cars, it's very similar to that long pan in Goodfellas, where the camera's following them into the nightclub. And people are always talking about what a powerful scene that is. But check it out. If you were to watch that scene with the volume off, it wouldn't be nearly as powerful. That music cue that Henry Mancini writes, it's got this conga drum and this incredible it's almost an orchestral fanfare at the beginning. And I've always loved that music. So I actually opened my album with that bit from Touch of Evil that's from that scene.
Yeah, it has that driving power to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the marriage of the visual with the aural. It's the way that the music serves the narrative that makes it so powerful.
Oh, excellent. Now, it sounds like you're on the road pretty much nonstop. But when you get a rare free evening and you can relax and have a cocktail, what are your go-to artists from the past that you listen to? And also the corollary to that, which noir movies do you find yourself watching over and over again?
Okay, well, to tell you the truth, when I get a night off, I like to sit by the fire, have a refreshing beverage, pet my dog, and binge watch Netflix. I rarely am like, let me have a night off, now let me listen to some of my favorite music. I actually, to be quite honest, I get burned out on music. I listen to music all the time, and I do love it. But a true night off, they say something about a bus driver's holiday. I don't go out and listen to my buddies play. I don't go home and put on, the great works of, Chopin on the stereo. I will watch, right now I'm watching Homeland, and I'm anxious to get a day off so that I can catch up on that stuff, so that's a thing. And then, but you asked about some of my favorite films. I actually, had the good fortune of about 10 years ago, Eddie Muller, my friend Eddie, who I know you interviewed for your podcast.
Oh yeah, he's a great guy.
He's fantastic, and he and I co-curated a jazz noir film festival for the San Francisco Jazz Festival, and we had this great conversation where we started out with a list of like 30 films, and we pared it down to 5, and the idea was that they had to be films with a noir sensibility and a jazz soundtrack. And it turned out that they're all 5 are 5 of my very favorite movies from the genre. Let's see, we had Sweet Smell of Success from '59.
Oh, that is wonderful and underrated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love, there's so many great lines. I love this dirty town. There's so much great stuff in that movie. And then Elmer Bernstein. I get confused. It's Leonard Bernstein and Elmer Bernstein, or did I get it backwards?
I think you had it right.
All right. And then, let's see, we had Anatomy of a Murder, also from '59.
Oh, yeah, great stuff.
Duke Ellington score. I Want to Live, I think that was '58. That's Johnny Mandel.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Miles did the Elevator to the Gallows soundtrack in '57.
Oh, wow.
And then Touch of Evil. That's Bernard Herrmann, who did all the great Hitchcock movies and also that sci-fi stuff.
Wow, those are all particularly dark stuff there.
Yeah, dark, very dark, but also very much jazz. There's that great big band stuff going on in Sweet Smell of Success. And that was one of my first, the very first time I saw that, and they have those shots of New York at night. and you know, the camera sweeping across the night cityscape, and the band's like, and you're just like, yeah, I want to go to the city.
I know, it's so huge. It's so important. It's so important to that movie. And by the end of that movie, you're thinking, wow, I do not want to go to the city.
I know, exactly. And also, like, if I ever meet a critic as evil as that guy, that Burt Lancaster, that guy was stone evil.
Oh, it was great. Okay, now you touched on this earlier, and listening to your work, you can really hear some of the great improvisational stuff come through. But when you're working on a theme project like Jazz Noir, are you still able to bring that energy and that creativity when you have that framework and theme?
Yeah, I think you can if you hire the right people. Mm-hmm. And I feel like one of my real strengths as an artist has always been knowing who to hire and not putting too much in the way of restrictions on them. So we write arrangements, we prepare arrangements, and we rehearse them, but they're loose enough that you can change them on the fly. And if somebody feels inspired to play something that's different than what's written on the page, you know, they have the freedom to do it. And you mentioned that I studied with Art Farmer, and you know, he was so incredibly wise and very generous with his time and his talent. And one time I asked him, you know, why is it that your bands always sound so good? Because he lived in Vienna, Austria, Stephen, and he would spend like half the year in the States touring, but often he wasn't able to bring his band on the road, so he would work with, you know, different rhythm sections. And yet, you know, they always sounded tight. They always sounded so together and so professional, so soulful.
Yeah, I never would have guessed that.
Yeah, it was really something. And I asked him, I was like, well, what's the secret? And I thought he was going to tell me something about, you know, how important it is to rehearse and you know, the chemistry. But, you know, I thought it would be something like that. And he said, man, Dmitri, if you find you're the smartest cat in the room, you're in the wrong room. You know, and it just basically comes down to you surround yourself with talent greater than your own, and you turn them loose and you let them do what they do. And then it doesn't matter if you're playing, you know, I don't know, Audrey's Dance, you know, from Twin Peaks, or All the Things You Are. You know, the cats know what to do.
That's great. It brings something there that it may be even greater than what you intended it to be.
Yeah, and often it is. I mean, I'll have an idea in my mind of what I want, and what we end up with is something a little different. That's almost always better because of the contributions the other people make. You know, whereas if you went in there and you were like, listen, you need to play it exactly like this, then you're writing chamber music. You know, then it's about like let me render what the composer has in mind, as opposed to let me just use this song as a topic and we're going to have a conversation, you know, which is the sensibility that I think is what the jazz musician is looking for.
Yeah, it does seem that, you know, that's more of a there's a place for both, but jazz seems to really bring that energy, and it really seems to come alive with that improvisation. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, it's an African-American art form, and freedom is a big part of it, even in the music that is not, you know, quote-unquote free jazz. The idea of freedom and expressing your you know, my teacher would say to me, he was like, man, you're not really improvising. You know, quit performing. Let's have a conversation. And his idea was that the music itself is a conversation. And he used to say that when I was younger, and I would say, well, do you mean like music is the international language, and he goes, no, I don't mean it's like a conversation. He's like, it's not a metaphor. I mean, let's have a conversation. And he would describe, like, were you at the show last night? Man, Clifford, he's talking about his saxophone player, Clifford Jordan. He'd be like, Cliff said, "Bazoozoit." So I said, "Bazida." And then he said, "Bazoozoit." So I said, "Bazoozoit." Right. And this is a musician talking to another musician about music. And it was so funny to me at the time. I was like, oh, he's not saying, oh, he started on the natural nine, and then he played a blues lick, and then he played, the Mixolydian dominant. No, he said bazoozoit. It's a whole different way of kind of thinking of music as just like we're having a talk, a conversation among friends. Yeah.
Actually, conversation is a great way to describe it. That really helps me articulate what I think jazz should be. That is a great term.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think if you and I are kind of the same, I think we both want to hear something minor and a little bit haunting and a little bit visual and cinematographic,
definitely.
And that's the jazz that we favor, and probably that's the literature and the movies that we like too.
So I think they just weave together.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, where do you see the future of the mediums, both jazz and noir? They're sometimes considered older mediums, but they're certainly you certainly see them in places here. Is there room for both of them in an internet society?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you were talking to Eddie, he mentioned Iranian noir, and like getting now in his festival, they're taking a more international approach. And so right away, you're saying that, this is not music that's relegated to a particular period or a particular country. It's not just post-war America. It's happening now on the other side of the planet, And jazz is the same way. Jazz is a music that was born 100 years ago. Some brilliant African-American musicians created it. And now it's played and enjoyed by people all over the world. And if you check out like the jazz that's, say, coming out of, for example, Norway, these Norwegian musicians are taking improvisation and elements of American jazz and using it to kind of fuse with their own folkloric music and their own trade. It's really cool to kind of think about the national character of different places and the way that, like, someone who lives in the sticks, that their music might sound kind of pastoral, and someone that lives in the big city might write music that sounds like the city. Mm-hmm. And certainly, someone that lives in Sweden is going to write and play music that sounds kind of Swedish. I had this friend she's a wonderful composer, and she's from Azerbaijan and lived in Holland for a while, and she now lives in New York City. And her name's Amina Figurova. And when she first started playing jazz, she was a classically trained concert pianist. Mm-hmm. And she very quickly, because she has amazing technique and great ears, she very quickly learned to improvise. But her references when she would play a solo, where an American musician would play a lot of blues, and you'd hear this sort of the blues influence and the kind of Americana kind of influence. She would often quote from chamber music and Rachmaninoff and the symphonic tradition. And although she's improvising, those were the building blocks in her, and also from songs from her native country. And I thought that was so fascinating to realize that it's like these are words and phrases, and we have them in common, but we can use them to express whatever. So to get back to your question, I think the world is becoming more global. People are traveling more. Back in the day, you might say to someone, if you're ever in Kansas City, go hear Jay McShann. Mm-hmm. And there'd be like a Kansas City jazz sound, for example. And now a musician that lives and works in Kansas City is watching the same television shows and movies that we're watching around the world, is listening to the same music, and because of, iTunes and Spotify and everything else, has access to what's happening right now in Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco. And so there's this sort of, the music is reaching across international boundaries and traveling around the world, and I think that's beautiful. I really do.
Yeah, it really does add to, it adds more to the art forms. But also, I really do get hung up when people say, well, you know, in order for something to be really noir, it has to happen between this time period and this time period.
Yeah.
Then it means the art's dead.
Yeah, that's right. That's what it would mean if that were true, but it isn't anymore. And you know, Eddie's Festival proves it. I've been able to contribute some music to some modern noir films and things like that, and it's been really fun to kind of see that my music repurposed in that way. I'd love to write something specifically for a film sometime. I've never had that experience.
Oh, well, I'm sure you will. You're all over pretty much the entire jazz landscape. Before we go, what would you like to tell our audience about jazz noir and anything else that you want to give to our audience?
Oh, well, I would say let's keep melody alive. Let's keep melody first and foremost in music. Art Farmer used to say, you know, there's elements of music, melody, harmony, rhythm, form, lyrics, phrasing, nuance, articulation, intonation, all these things. Melody comes first. Melody comes first and matters most. Melody is the soul of a song. And again, in you know, whatever style of music you happen to like, that's fine. But look for melody. You know, melody is just such a strong. It's where the message gets delivered. You know, and as far as my project, as far as Jazz Noir, you know, it's available everywhere, and I hope people dig it. And if they get curious about some of these films and television shows that I reference, check those out too.
Well, they certainly will dig it. I know I have been.
So thank you. We've
been speaking with Dmitri Matheny, and you can find his internet home is at dmitrimatheny.com.
Yeah, if you can spell it, you can find it.
We'll make sure we put some links on the website for that.
Right on. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Well, thank you. It was great talking to you.
Really, really great talking to you, too.